So we hear about these devastating natural disasters all the time, right? But we rarely get the full picture. Yeah, like we see the headlines, the overall death tolls, but what about the impact on individual communities? Well, that's what we're going to do today. We're taking a deep dive into the aftermath of Hurricane Helene.
And this is a particularly interesting case study because, as we know, the storm itself was only part of the story.
Exactly, and we're really honing in on Buncombe County, North Carolina. This article from the Daily Beast from September 30th, 2024 really caught our eye. One-third of Hurricane Helene's deaths happened in one North Carolina county. Just that headline alone is pretty jarring.
It really highlights that even in a widespread disaster like this, local factors can make a huge difference when it comes to the impact.
For sure. So this article paints a really vivid picture of the situation on the ground there. It basically says that Buncombe County is unrecognizable after Helene, like entire communities just wiped off the map. The article quotes the Buncombe County manager, April Pender, as saying, "Those communities no longer resemble what they were a week ago, and our loved ones are still trapped." I mean, just let that sink in for a moment. That's a week after the storm hit, and people are still trapped.
It's a tragic reminder that behind all the statistics, there are real people and families going through unimaginable hardship.
Absolutely. And I think it also forces us to look at the role of geography in all of this. We all knew Helene was a Category 4 hurricane, right? A major storm.
Right.
But why Buncombe County specifically? Why did they get hit so much harder than other places in Helene's path?
Well, the article points to the fact that Buncombe County is situated in the Appalachian Mountains. It's a beautiful area, no doubt, but it's also really susceptible to things like landslides and flash floods, especially with the kind of torrential rainfall that a hurricane like Helene brings.
So the same storm, in the same region even, can have completely different outcomes depending on the terrain. And that makes you wonder, were there other pre-existing issues that might have made Buncombe County even more susceptible to this kind of devastation?
Yeah, and that's something that's often overlooked, right? We tend to focus on the immediate impact of the storm itself, but the reality is these pre-existing conditions, like you were saying with the terrain, they can really make or break a community's ability to weather the storm, so to speak.
Totally. And it's not just about the initial hit either, right? This article really gets into those cascading effects in the days following the storm.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a domino effect. The storm hits, and then suddenly you've got widespread power outages, nearly 100,000 people without power, cell services down, roads are impassable, and basic supplies become incredibly difficult to come by.
Yeah, and that really hits home when you read quotes from people on the ground. Like there's this one line from a resident that just stayed with me. "We need food and we need water." I mean, it's just that simple, that desperate.
Right. It really underscores how vulnerable people become when those lifelines are cut off. And it's in those moments that you really see the importance of community response and those larger aid efforts.
Speaking of aid, there were some glimmers of hope mentioned in the article. Things like food and water distribution centers being set up and attempts to get those temporary cell towers up and running.
And as simple as those things sound, they can literally mean the difference between life or death in those early days. Communication is everything in a disaster scenario. It allows rescue workers to coordinate their efforts. Families can try to connect with loved ones. And for people who are trapped or isolated, it offers a much-needed sense of hope.
That lifeline to the outside world.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine what a relief that must be.
Absolutely. And the article also touches on FEMA's response to the disaster. Administrator Deanne Criswell visited some of the hardest-hit areas in Florida and Georgia, and President Biden pledged to visit as soon as possible. But, without wanting to hinder any of the ongoing rescue efforts, of course.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that because it makes you think about the bigger picture here. Could something like what happened in Buncombe County serve as a wake-up call for how we approach disaster preparedness, especially when it comes to these geographically vulnerable areas?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it goes beyond just reacting after a disaster has already struck. It's about proactively identifying those areas that are most at risk, investing in more resilient infrastructure, and maybe most importantly, fostering a culture of preparedness at the community level.
So it's about recognizing that these events, as devastating as they are, aren't just isolated incidents. They expose these larger systemic vulnerabilities that we really can't afford to ignore. It's easy to get caught up in the immediacy of it all, like the rescue efforts and getting aid to where it's needed. But this article also got me thinking about the long game, the long road to recovery for a place like Buncombe County.
Oh, absolutely. That's where the conversation really needs to shift from response to resilience. Because rebuilding in a place like Buncombe County, it's not just about physical structures, right?
Hmm.
It's about rebuilding lives, rebuilding communities, and addressing the trauma that people have experienced.
Yeah, it's about putting the pieces back together after a loss like this.
Uh-huh.
And that's something you can't really put a timeline on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one thing that often gets overlooked in these situations is the mental and emotional toll on everyone involved.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the survivors, the first responders, even the people watching from afar. It takes a toll.
Right. It makes you wonder what kind of support systems need to be in place to address those long-term needs. Things like mental health resources, economic recovery programs. It's a whole other layer of complexity.
It really is. And it highlights the need for a more holistic approach to disaster recovery.
Ugh.
We can't just focus on rebuilding buildings. We have to rebuild lives and livelihoods as well.
Well said. So we started this deep dive with this really stark statistic. 1/3 of Hurricane Helene's deaths occurred in just one county, Buncombe County, North Carolina. And I think we've uncovered so much more than just a number. We've explored the geographical vulnerabilities, the systemic challenges, and this really long and complicated road to recovery that lies ahead.
And I think for me, if there's one thing I want listeners to take away from this conversation, is that behind every statistic, every headline, there's a human story. The people of Buncombe County, their strength, their resilience in the face of unimaginable loss, that's what we should all remember.
Absolutely. Well said. Disasters like this, they expose our vulnerabilities for sure, but they also reveal incredible strength. So as we move forward from this conversation, let's remember the human stories at the heart of it all. Let's learn from these experiences, and let's all ask ourselves, what can we do to create a safer, more resilient future for everyone?